All right, how's everybody doing? This is the Comic Samurai. I want to welcome you to my next video, and tonight we're going to be looking at my favorite controversial comic books. Now, these are comics that have some kind of a divisive story or a controversy indelibly tied to them. And I like that because, after all, what are comic books but good stories? Let's go ahead and jump right in. First up, we got this X-Men number 118, and it was written by Grant Morrison with art by Ethan Van Sciver. Now, this comic came out, and Wizard Magazine did a big article on it where they found a couple of instances where they had snuck in the word sex in some of the backgrounds. Now, you can go to the internet and do a search and find the examples, and I think they're up to 18 that they found. But from time to time, more and more do crop up. So I encourage you, you can pick up this comic book pretty cheap, but get it, read through it, and keep your eye open for it and see if you can see any of them. I couldn't find one without being pointed out, because they are pretty subtle. But what makes it really interesting is that the story kind of parallels that. It deals with pushing, like Emma Frost pushes the pleasure centers of a large group of people. And it's like, did she break the fourth wall and push our pleasure centers too? Is it all subliminal? Is it all in our head? Because all of the creators deny doing it. But once you see it, it's like, I don't know, they couldn't have done it on accident. But it's one of my favorites. What a great way to start it. All of these are going to have great examples. Next up, we got New Mutants number 91. And I loved Rob Liefeld's run on the New Mutants. It's what introduced me to his work. And what makes this one so exciting is that later I found out that it's a cover swipe. And those are controversial in themselves when they take it and they just kind of trace the art. It's different than an homage where they take a general idea of an image and do something similar. But look at this example from ROM number 9. You can see that in the bottom there, those skeletons are almost a tracing of what was done in this ROM comic. And there's other examples where Liefeld kind of used images from ROM comic books, but that's the most blatant example right there. And I wanted to show one more of the most infamous examples of a swipe cover. And this is Ride number 0, put out by Valiant Comics. And when this cover was done, it was really hailed as a great graphically done cover. And later they found out somebody superimposed this image done by Mike Zeck of the Punisher. And you can see that they put it right over that image of Rye, and it's such a tracing. I mean, it's almost line for line. So those are my favorite swipe cover examples. Moving on from that, we got Transformers number 13. And just seeing this image, you can see how it would have been controversial, making a toy that turns into a pretty realistic metal handgun and then featuring it on the cover of a comic book. That Megatron, he just was an evil character, and he's controversial to this day just because he does become a gun. And in the hands of a child, nobody will argue that that's probably not a great image to put on a cover. Next up, we got Avengers number 218, and this is another one that involves a child handling a gun. And on this one, not only is he handling it, but he has it pointed at his own head. I am amazed that this made it past the censors. I understand that the story deals with it and they kind of push it away, but just having that image, it is shocking and it can be divisive. Next up, we got Lobo's Back number 2, and this one is a callback to the hidden image. And this is supposed to be on the cover. Simon Bisley drew a penis. Now, I don't know. I wouldn't have seen it, and I wouldn't have called that out. But a lot of people were up in arms that he snuck in a graphic image on this cover. And I'll let you be the judge. Maybe I'll let you take a closer look there. I don't know. Let me know what you think, though. I don't think it's that graphic. Next up, we got X-Men number 122. And this has got a controversial cover that only I've noticed. I've never heard anybody else talk about it. But this is a cover done by Frank Quietly. And I think that this one's got a hidden image in it, more apparent than that Lobo's Back one. I mean, if you look at the folds of Lilandra's dress here, I think that that's a lot more graphic and a lot more intentional than that Lobo one. Let me know what you think, though. But once you see it, I don't think that you can unsee it. That's a fun one. All right. Next up, we got Trouble, #1. Now, this was a 5-issue limited series written by Mark Millar. And when I heard about this one, I picked it up because I thought it was going to be kind of a preview of Peter Parker's parents and Uncle Ben, and that kind of the story of their origin. But I don't think it was. And this cover, all of them had photographic covers, and the models on them were just young people. And it touched on some adult themed issues. And when you put that in the context of young teens, it's controversial. All right, next up, we got Green Lantern #54. And this is probably the most well-known controversial comic that I'm going to show. This is the one where Green Lantern's villain, Major Force, killed Kyle Rayner's girlfriend, Alex DeWitt, and put her body into a refrigerator. And it's become a symbol of dehumanizing female characters in comic books and using them as plot devices. And the term is known as women in refrigerators. And this is an example of that. It's a controversial comic and a death for sure. Next up, we got Avengers #200. And this is another one that's got notoriety for a bad reason. This is where Carol Danvers was impregnated and dehumanized in this comic book. And it is one of the darker times in the Avengers run. Women are not presented how they should be in comic books. A lot of people had issue with this comic, and for good reason. I mean, you can go onto the internet and find out the deeper story, but it's not pretty. Next up, we got Avengers #213, and this is another infamous comic book where Hank Pym strikes Janet, his wife, in the face. And I've read that Jim Shooter, the writer, meant it to be an accident in the story, but the artist interpreted it as more of a purposeful, abusive strike. Either way, dealing with that issue of spousal abuse in comic books was controversial, and how Hank ever came back from that and overcame that, it'll always be a stink that hovers over that character because of this comic book. Next up, we got Iron Man #182, and this is one of those alcoholism covers. Everybody's seen that one where he's looking at himself in the mirror with a bottle, but this one is just as dark, in my opinion, where it says he's going to be dead or sober. It's one of the two in the morning, and him sitting out in a snowstorm. That scene is kind of reminiscent of that Jack Nicholson scene in The Shining, where he's in the maze and he's sitting there and he ends up dying in that movie. So you're like, oh, is Tony Stark going to die too? Next up, we got Preacher #23. And this whole Preacher series was a bit controversial. It dealt with a lot of the Catholic and Christian mythos, and it kind of took some liberties with them. And in this one, you find out that the whole reason behind Jesse Custer's powers is that he's inhabited by the offspring of a demon and an angel. And this cover depicts them fornicating or having sex and creating that being. I mean, it doesn't show any genitalia, but it's darn close. This is like the moment of creation, if you know what I'm saying. So it can be a controversial cover. Next up, we got Chosen #1, and this is another Mark Millar written comic book. And this was very divisive. It dealt with the second coming, and people are led to believe, and they worship this kid who's supposed to be the second coming of Jesus. And it ends up, that is not the case. It couldn't be further from the case. This is a graphic, dark, I am surprised Dark Horse printed this comic book, but I enjoyed it. I like a good controversy. Next up, we got Savage Dragon #39. And this one introduces this character whose power, his name's Dung, is to shoot feces. He can somehow transport feces from all over the world and shoot it out of his armholes and just blast you with poop. I mean, people didn't know what to think of that. And I just love how creative Eric Larson got with some of his villains. Next up, we got Captain Marvel #34. And this is the comic book that introduced that character Nitro, who set up a trap for Captain Marvel. And in the process of defeating that trap, Captain Marvel was exposed to a gas that was a carcinogen, and he ended up getting cancer from it. This comic was the starting point, the catalyst of that, and it reached its fruition in this Death of Captain Marvel graphic novel done by Marvel Comics. Now, this was the first graphic novel that Marvel Comics did, and it's controversial because it was the death of an actual figure. And as far as I know, it's one of the few, very, very few main deaths of a character in comics where they stayed dead. There were rules for me. You never brought back Captain Marvel, Jason Todd, or Bucky Barnes. And they broke 2 of the 3 rules. So this is one of my favorite comic books until they bring him back, which I hope they never do. That'll make it controversial. Oh, that Captain Marvel. He's a great character, and he deserves to rest in peace, in my opinion. Next up is Wildcats number 10. Now, I was so excited to see Chris Claremont working with Jim Lee on Jim Lee's Wildcats series. And they were going to introduce this new big character in the Image universe called the Huntsman. And I thought he was such a great character. Come to find out, he lasted a couple issues, made like 18 appearances or something, and then that was it. And I was just, I was let down. The controversy of I was built up to really like this character. So that was a bit of a letdown controversy. Next up is Spawn number 9. Now this has got to be one of the most financially controversial ones. And this comic book introduced a bunch of new characters, including this Angela. And it went on to be pretty successful, and apparently Gaiman and McFarlane didn't have a written contract. They just had a word-of-mouth agreement, and they ended up going to court over it. And by the end of it, there was millions of dollars at stake, and it's just a controversial comic book. This is probably the most expensive to produce comic book ever written. That's crazy, the story on that. Next up is Cerebus number 56. And there can be controversial comic books because of the notoriety or just what goes along with the creator. And in this one, Dave Sim is the creator. And he went on to make some statements that some people would say are very controversial. I'll let you dive into it if you're interested, but sometimes, like I said, it's just the creators, politics, and some of the statements they make that can be controversial. Next up is Amazing Spider-Man number 238. And the reason this one is controversial is because of this little blurb right here that says, included is a tattoo. So in the back of this comic was a little paper envelope, and inside of that was a little teeny tattoo. So you can shine a light and see if your tattoo is still intact. And this one is. And the value is really dependent on the state of that tattoo. And what's interesting is that that wasn't the only comic book produced that month. I believe there were a handful of others, but the most famous one is this Fantastic Four number 252. And this is a horizontal cover also. You know what? I am actually going to turn it so that it's right side up. I like seeing those, how they're supposed to be presented. But you can see that this one came with a tattoo also. So you'll find that a lot of these copies have the tattoo removed because it was just a folded piece of paper sealed into the comic, and they're indistinguishable from the Amazing Spider-Man comic as far as I know. Now, I'd love to do some more further research on this one and see if they were all the same tattoos. Mine's a little bug, like a ladybug, I think, when I shine a light, or strawberry or something. I can't really remember, but it's just a little circle. Anyway, next up is Powers number 31. And this went on to be a really controversial comic book because of the storytelling technique that Brian Michael Bendis used in this story. It tells the story of the origin of the main male lead in this and how he the origin of his powers. But it goes back to prehistoric times when kind of Cro-Magnons were still on the earth, like monkey people, and you get to see them interact. And they don't speak English or any language really, but grunts. And people were really put off by that style. And there's a couple sex scenes of these monkey creatures. And I mean, that's what they used as currency then, was kind of their access to females and to be able to breed with them. And that can be a controversial topic for sure. All right, I always save the best for last. And next up is Miracleman number 1. And this is a reprint copy right here that I'm showing, done by Marvel. And the reason that I find this so controversial is because the originals were some of my favorite comic books of all time. And they had some controversial stories that touched on some topics that aren't usually dealt with in comics. But this one reprinted them after years of legal battles. Marvel finally got the rights to reprint them, but then when they did such a disservice to this comic book, in my opinion. They put in unneeded edits where it didn't need to be, and they changed the coloring. A big part of the story was how it was colored for me. And when you look at this updated version, it is not only ugly, in my opinion, but it takes away and it contradicts what the story was trying to get across in a lot of places. The entire magic of this comic book was removed for me by the coloring and the unnecessary edits done in this. And it's such a disservice to the new readers who don't have access to the originals. The only thing they ever saw were these reprints. And what a letdown. That's controversial in my opinion. Now, that's only one of the controversies. On the other hand is the whole court debate and battle over the rights of that. And they wrote an entire book about the rights of it, the history of the character, Alan Moore's involvement, Neil Gaiman, even Alex Ross. I mean, there are so many people who had their fingers in the pie of this Miracleman comic, and this Komoda, his magic word, is the telling of that story. So if you're interested, you can read all about it. But I love my controversial comic books, but I want to know what your favorite controversial comics are. So let me know what I missed. Thanks for joining me and have a great night.